Hey folks, I'm Brown Bear. Today I'll be doing an in-depth review of Age of Empires 4. I'll be covering any aspect of the game that comes to mind, but I'll focus mostly on the single-player campaigns and the ranked competitive multiplayer. If you're only interested in my thoughts on the multiplayer, I've put a timestamp link in the video description below. I've also gotten some feedback that my videos are a little slow. That's actually intentional. They're intended to be something where you relax and watch comfortably. More rapid-paced viewers may benefit from watching at 1.25x or 1.5x speed. Age of Empires 4 was launched in 2021 for the PC platform. Age 4 represents the latest in the legendary Age of Empires franchise, a long-running series of real-time strategy games first released in the late 90s. Ensemble Studios, the company behind the franchise, was shut down by Microsoft in 2009. Fortunately, Microsoft later decided to continue the Age series, handing off development to Relic and announcing this most recent game in mid-2017. I'm gonna start today by talking about the campaigns. There are 4 single-player campaigns, each containing between 8 and 10 missions. Each campaign begins with a cutscene establishing the historical background and setting the stage for the player's entrance. Following missions continue the story with more cutscenes, historical videos, pages from history, and so forth. At the end of each campaign, there's another long cinematic closing out the story and providing some sense of resolution. Presentation-wise, I really like the way this was done. The developers put together a toolkit of storytelling devices and used them in different ways to construct a narrative. The most common tool is just classic cinematography. The developers went out and captured real-life footage of places relevant to the campaigns. Everything from the Mongolian steppes, to modern Moscow, to grass battlefields in the English countryside are featured in this campaign. The camera work here is pretty engaging and feels as good as anything you might see in a documentary on, say, Netflix. Included in the cinematography is staged live-action footage. My favorite example of this is this cutscene from the Rise of Moscow campaign, where a Russian soldier hands tribute to a Mongol horseman. You can feel the hierarchy in this exchange and get a taste of what it was like to be a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. I'm glad they didn't rely on this too much, because the line between engaging and kishy is a very hard one to navigate. The tidbits they did include work really well and show some good restraint on the part of the producers. A technique they leaned on much more heavily is the use of animations on top of real-life footage. One of the great aspects of this approach is that it ages very well. Your imagination fills in the gaps rather than critiquing minor inaccuracies in a staged live-action shot. This extends into the gameplay itself, including building silhouettes, construction animations, and siege weapons packing and unpacking. In fact, this technique appears in so many places, I would argue it's the defining aesthetic of this game. It was even part of some earlier previews. I think simple animations and even plain two-dimensional graphical art are really underrated in modern game development. Not everything needs to be photorealistic to be a good form of presentation. The last thing I'll mention here are the maps themselves, showing how territory changed and shifted hands over time. This is often combined with portraits of different historical figures to represent different factions. There's nothing particularly amazing about this, but it's a clean and solid form of storytelling that does its job without getting in the way. My main complaint would be that without the context of modern geography, it can be hard to understand how much territory a picture like this actually represents. In fact, while the underlying map is useful as a narrative device, it's not very useful at conveying historical information. Putting it all together, I really like the way the campaign is presented. I find it a lot more engaging than the presentation style in Age of Empires 2, and I think it stacks up well against the animated cutscenes of either Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2. It simply feels good. It's professionally produced, high-quality work. As someone who was skeptical of Age of Empires 4 when it was first announced, I was pleasantly surprised to see how much work was put into the presentation of these campaigns. It quashed any nagging doubts I had about Relic's intentions with this franchise. This game feels like a labor of love put together by people who actually intended to make something good. Sadly for everyone involved, a developer's good intentions are not enough to actually produce a good game. There's really no easy way of putting it. The campaign gameplay is really bad. It's overambitious, repetitive, uncreative, badly scripted, and badly executed. The campaign suffers from several thematic issues that appear repeatedly in different missions. The largest, from my perspective, is overambitiousness or overscaling. Several campaign missions are simply too big. Take the second Rise of Moscow mission, Tribute, as one example. In this mission, you're tasked with collecting taxes from neighboring Rus settlements in order to pay tribute to your Mongol overlords. This eventually turns into acquiring the settlements themselves as part of expanding Moscow. Your main antagonist comes in the form of roving bandit parties. Clearing these out is presented as an optional objective. Conceptually, I like this idea. Trade plays a larger role in Age of Empires 4 than it did in previous games. It features new mechanics like neutral marketplaces, as well as landmarks like the Mongol Silver Tree. The problem is the execution. This mission is too big. The map size is so large that it's impractical to move your army from one side to the other. It's better to multitask multiple armies against different groups of bandits. This is tedious and demanding, even for a higher level player like myself. The mission parameters are similarly oversized. Instead of securing 1 or 2 trade routes while clearing 1 or 2 bandit camps, the player is tasked with buying 5 settlements and clearing 6 bandit camps. It's simply too much. It drags and eventually becomes boring. This issue of overscaling shows up repeatedly. In Mongol Empire No. 2, the player is tasked with clearing 3 separate bandit camps on opposite sides of a gigantic map. In Normans No. 8, they need to clear 4 very large French reinforcement groups. And in the Rise of Moscow No. 5, they need to claim not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 separate towns in order to finally clear the mission. A single creative idea can only sustain so much content. Each of these missions features an interesting concept, but that concept becomes boring when it's stretched across a long, tedious mission. It would have been much better to condense these and other missions so that they were shorter and more focused. A related problem to the overscaling is the large amount of macro management within these campaigns. I once read a review of Warcraft 3 that coined the term build a base itis to describe the frequency with which players needed to build a base from scratch just to get going on a mission. I don't remember who invented this term, but it's a good diagnosis for what plagues Age of Empires 4. The developers lean on base building too much as a gameplay concept, and it's just not very interesting. Consider the 6th mission of the Mongol campaign. This mission is entirely base building. In fact, it's literally just building as much stuff as you can before the timer runs out. This pattern of macro management under the gun is reused in several other missions, like Normans No. 7, 100 Years No. 4, and Rise of Moscow No. 6. I think it's reasonable that a game called Age of Empires would feature missions involving empire building. But I think it's not executed in an interesting way, and I'll offer 2 reasons for that perspective. First, very few missions provide you with an interesting base with some kind of strategic considerations or economic trade-offs. On your screen, you'll see 3 different starting bases from the 100 Years' War campaigns, No. 2, No. 5, and No. 7. Notice how they're just towns surrounded by a ring of walls. Nothing really stands out, even though base building is arguably the crux of all 3 of these missions. Sometimes, this pattern is extended to almost absurd lengths. Take the Normans campaign No. 6. This is a mission about a large army cutting off a city and besieging it. This should be a mission about smart military tactics and using the right units in the right way to defeat a more powerful force. In fact, that's what the first 10 minutes of the mission are actually about. Unfortunately, the rest of the mission centers around macro-managing your town into an economic powerhouse so you can build a gigantic army and clear out your opponents. Even in a mission where you're besieged and trapped in, the developers still find a way to force you to macro. A second thematic issue with the base building in these campaigns is that they don't do a good job showcasing different parts of the gameplay. StarCraft 2 did a really good job with this. The first half of each mainline campaign features missions that are dedicated to individual unit types. This results in a lot of really creative missions which showcase depth in the gameplay that players might not otherwise see. This includes stuff like the packing and unpacking of Vikings, the shoot and move capabilities of Diamondbacks, and the interaction between stealth and detector range for Dark Templars. A linchpin to this design approach is that building the wrong unit often causes the player to lose. Choosing Marines over Marauders makes the Great Train Robbery a more difficult mission. Avoiding tanks in the dig makes it practically impossible. Forcing the player down a specific strategic path is actually quite smart, because it makes the player feel like they've figured something out when they build the correct units. This makes the gameplay both diverse and engaging. You feel like if you think about the scenario and do what makes sense, the game will reward you. The macro management in Age of Empires 4 is not similarly directed at some particular goal. Players can kind of build whatever they want. Because your opponent has seemingly infinite resources and infinite units, players are encouraged to choose whatever they think is their civilization's best unit composition. This results in missions feeling very similar, even if they are conceptually very different. A long period of macro management, followed by the construction of a similar army to your last mission, followed by attack moving across maps that often feel interchangeable. The overscaling and over-reliance on macro management are thematic issues that plague the design of these missions, but there are also some practical issues with the campaigns that are just as important as these design problems. I feel like there's a basic lack of craftsmanship. Campaign missions sometimes feel very slapdash. Consider Mongol Empire No. 7. Conceptually, this is an interesting concept with a lot of potential. Players are tasked with establishing a blockade around a large city. They're given a large amount of resources, production structures, and a small army to get started. When players are ready, they can move their armies into position and defend each choke point separately. The problem with this mission is that it's not executed very well. First, there's the problem of zoom. Because you can't zoom out very far, it's hard to pan from one army to the next. Second, your units are just not very smart. I failed this mission on my first try because when I wasn't looking, my northern army decided to stray into Chinese static defenses and got melted. Third, your allied units don't seem to be scripted correctly. In many instances, my allied forces stood in the back and simply did nothing while my army did all of the work, despite my best attempts to get them to engage. There's a lack of polish in this mission that detracts from the experience. I think this scenario and several others would have benefited from additional playtesting. For example, it takes a full 3 minutes for your production structures to get to where they need to go. 3 minutes where you're just sitting and waiting for them to move across the map. A second thing that feels a little sloppy about the campaigns is the unit AI. As far as I can tell, when the campaign designers placed units on the map, they specified specific zones that those units are not supposed to leave. If you try to pull units out of those zones, they eventually turn back and head home, a behavior that I'll label leashing. Unit leashing is implemented in a very strange way. Take this example from Mongol Empire No. 5. The player is tasked with clearing a large regiment of Polish cavalry. The smart way to do that is to use Mangadai to run and shoot. The problem is that these cavalry are partially leashed, so they run back and forth instead of chasing your units. This means you can clear several of them for free before they figure out what to do. 100 Years' War No. 3 is a more egregious example. Players are tasked with liberating towns that are filled with an enormous number of militia. The easiest way to do this is to simply abuse the leashing behavior and clear both towns with just a handful of archers. This leaves enough units at home to defend against English raids. You could argue that I'm just cheesing, that it's my choice to abuse these mechanics, not a mistake on the part of the developers. But the way these missions are balanced implies that this is a part of how you're supposed to do them. Going back to Mongol Empire No. 5, on my first attempt I tried to play it straight up, thinking I could get the job done through smart unit choices and good micro. Unfortunately, this is just not possible, because the opposing Polish army has an insurmountable numerical advantage. The player is actually intended to split it off piece by piece while building more units and researching upgrades. If you do this, whether you like it or not, you'll end up abusing the leashing mechanic. The poor scripting logic of the enemy AI repeatedly detracted from my experience, whether it's these Chinese fire lancers refusing to move forward or these French knights refusing to attack anything. It was hard to get immersed in a scripted scenario when I wasn't sure whether the script was functioning. In sum, I was really disappointed by these campaigns. It's sad to see such great presentation get followed up by such poor gameplay. What bugs me is not so much the design, which is arguably a creative choice. It's the slapdash poor craftsmanship that bothers me the most. When I need to repeatedly build a forward base just to macro and close out a mission, the developers should wonder how this made it out of playtesting. When the hotkeys in single player are inexplicably different from the hotkeys in multiplayer, the developers should wonder how this made it out of playtesting. When a mission about a nomadic tribe blockading a city somehow becomes about macro-managing into the next Shenzhen, the developers should wonder how this made it out of playtesting. Sadly, I cannot recommend these campaigns to any new players. It's tough for me to say this because the presentation of the campaigns indicates to me that the developers had good intentions in producing this game. Unfortunately, those intentions didn't translate into a good single-player experience. I'll give these campaigns a solid 2 out of 10. Alrighty, next up I'd like to discuss the competitive multiplayer. I'll briefly describe my competitive history so you know where I'm coming from. I was formerly a top Age of Mythology and Age of Empires 3 player back when those games first came out. I even won a few tournaments back in the Age of Empires 3 days. I took a long break from RTS before starting to play StarCraft 2 in 2016. I eventually peaked in Masters 1. I switched over to Age of Empires 2 in 2020, where I played regularly at the top 1% level. My claim to fame is winning the top 2 groups of Hera's community tournament RBW number 3. Finally, I'm currently a top 200 player in Age of Empires 4. In summary, I play competitive RTS at a fairly high level. I mention this for 2 reasons. 1, I know that a lot of viewers determine the validity of someone's opinions on ranked play based on that person's rank. I think this is a flawed methodology, but convincing people otherwise is a truly Sisyphean task. It's easier to just state that I'm a high-level player. Second, the issues I experience at high-level ELO are sometimes different from the issues at lower levels. This influences which issues I prioritize and which ones I don't. I ask that you consider that before you assume I've under or overemphasized a particular issue. Age of Empires 4 features a fast-paced competitive multiplayer. I'd argue it's quite a bit faster than Age of Empires 2. This is accomplished through faster overall age progression, smaller maps, and a reshuffled technology tree. Aggression is more rewarded. Quick walling is no longer a mechanic, and full walling is more expensive to do than the second game. Several civilizations are also encouraged to play aggressively because of various second age bonuses. The English and French can produce units out of their main landmark, the Rus get early knights and extra gold, and the Mongols get double units through Ovu. I'm a fan of several of the design changes that Age of Empires 4 brought to the table. The best I'd say is moving town centers and battering rams to the second age. One of the frustrations I had with Age 2 was the dominance of the full walling meta. I felt that this made the game boring and reduced the overall strategic diversity. Age 4 tweaks this by enabling faster, earlier pushes. One of the subtler and smarter aspects of this approach is that it potentially offers some variety against fast tech. In Age of Empires 2, when you encounter an opponent who's fast castling, you generally need to go to the castle age yourself. You can commit a certain amount to an aggressive opener, and you can maybe even tower rush if your opponent got a bad map gen, but that's about it. In general, the correct response is to also go up to the castle age. I find this a little annoying. The correct reaction to a certain playstyle is to just play the same way yourself. Second age town centers allow for the possibility of going full feudal against a castle age tech build. The idea is that the feudal age player will have a larger number of weaker units because they have a much better economy. This allows them to go toe-to-toe with a higher tech opponent. This also gives players the confidence to do a second age push with the second town center as their follow-up. Even if the push fails, the player doesn't feel like they've automatically lost just because they're 1 age behind. This is at least theoretically how it could work. It does not actually work in today's meta, except maybe on closed maps like French Pass. Second town centers are expensive, castle age units are very good, and 1 TC pushes are very strong. Another underrated contributor to this is the way aging up doesn't interrupt villager production. This is a substantial boon to fast castle strategies. In general, the benefits of a second town center usually take too long to balance out the costs relative to other ways of playing the game. It's a good idea conceptually, but one that needs more tweaking. There's a few other design changes that I really like. The elimination of food decay and the removal of boar luring work in tandem to get rid of laming. Personally, I find this to be an unnecessarily luck-based component of Age 2. The inclusion of neutral marketplaces in 1 vs 1 is also a nice idea, if not currently well balanced. Finally, the addition of sacred sites rewards map control and multitasking very effectively. I think this is one of those design decisions that's going to look better and better as the game ages. Some of my best 1v1s came from battling over the different sacred sites on the map. All of these positive design changes, in combination with the fun of learning a new RTS, hooked me right from the start. I've already played well over 150 games, small compared to professional players, but a large amount for someone who plays casually. I started streaming again, and I even set a New Year's resolution to play a certain number of ranked games. I genuinely do enjoy competitive Age of Empires 4, and it's a game that I could see myself playing for a long time. Unfortunately, that is contingent on the developers making some serious changes to the way it currently works. Let me start with the interface. It's simply very difficult to click things in Age of Empires 4. Remember that this is a real-time strategy game. All you do is click on things. It's often painful to play this game because you can't trust that you'll reliably be able to manage your units. Multitasking is even more painful because you're already prone to making errors. It's often the case that I multitask back and forth between my army and economy, only to discover dozens of idle villagers that move commanded to a tree line instead of beginning to gather from it. The interface in general is pretty wonky. Placing your first town center as Mongols is hit or miss. So too is placing docks with any civilization. Selecting an enemy building highlights the garrisoned units, meaning you can't check its HP. Units that are told to attack an enemy unit simply stop in place if that unit is killed or moves out of line of sight, punishing multitasking and focus fire micro. Age 4 just doesn't feel comfortable to play, and that's before getting into all of the bugs. There are so many bugs in competitive play that someone even made a tier list just for the ones that only affect Delhi. These are excruciating, there's no other word to describe it. Villagers not properly returning to work, prelates not working correctly, imperial officials refusing to oversee production structures, it just goes on and on. Normally I would have some patience for a game that was just released, but many of these issues are both fundamental and obvious. How is it that the core mechanic of a civilization completely breaking in the first 30 seconds was not fixed months and months ago? My problems with competitive Age of Empires 4 sadly go deeper than just the bugs and the user interface. I think the single biggest issue with this game is lack of interesting skill expression. Skill expression is the ability for players to differentiate themselves from other players. Good real-time strategy games, and good competitive games in general, offer many interesting ways for players to express skill. This ensures good variety to the gameplay and allows players to individualize their styles and make the game their own. Age of Empires 4 offers a more limited approach to skill expression than Age of Empires 2. One good example is the relative lack of unit variety. There's more overlap across unit types, making unit choice less important. Archers and crossbows play different roles, but they're both under the umbrella of DPS, a sharp contrast from the orthogonal roles of the archer and skirmisher. Horsemen and lancers also feature too much overlap compared to the better separated roles of light cav and knights. Scorpions no longer exist, even though they offered an interesting niche role compared to mangonels. Monks can no longer directly convert, taking them out of the game too. The map balance also plays a role in reducing skill expression around unit choice. In Age of Empires 2, it's usually unsustainable to play a double gold composition, like crossbows and knights, due to the scarcity of gold. This means you have to mix different types of units into your army as you tech up. In Age 4, gold is plentiful, meaning that it's viable to regularly play compositions like Lancer Crossbow Siege. There's less of a need to mix in other types of units. From my perspective, unit choice in Age of Empires 2 is part of a larger umbrella of skill expression that I would label a technology tree traversal. This refers to the way you develop your tech tree, how you go from the first to the fourth age. Even though you often end up with relatively simple unit compositions, what matters is how you got there, the decisions you made, and why you made them. Let me walk through an example. Let's consider a very vanilla strategy: Japanese men-at-arms into archers, into crossbows, into arbalests. While the basic idea involves one unit for the entire game, how it plays out is much more complex. In the second age, the Japanese player might add spears to deal with a scouts rush. This is nice for Japan because they get good infantry, allowing their spears to transition into pikes. Other civilizations like the Mayans might prefer full walling due to their specific bonuses. Another alternative is to quick wall to buy time and add in scouts later in order to do an archer scouts push. This is reasonable as Japanese, who get bloodlines, but less of a good idea for civs like Koreans or Britons. Against other archer civs, a skirmisher opening is also perfectly serviceable. More likely than any of these is that the Japanese player will do a specialized 20-pop men-at-arms into archers opening, very aggressive and focused on pressuring the enemy. This is made possible by Japan's stronger infantry and cheaper drop-off points. As for defense, the Japanese player uses quick walls against melee units, and map awareness and positioning to defend against archer counterattacks. Moving into the third age, the Japanese player could do a standard transition into crossbows. This works for them, but is less of a good idea for civs like the Aztecs or Teutons who lack thumb ring and bracer respectively. Booming behind Monk Siege is another good option, though it depends on the map gen. Cav archers are another option because they're fully upgradable. Not a good idea for the Italians, who lack Parthian tactics. A cav archer transition is particularly good against knight civilizations, so if the player intended to do that, they may actually open scouts instead of men-at-arms. This wastes Japan's early game bonuses, but could work in situations where you definitely want cav archers. Finally, the Japanese player could even do a knight siege push, but I think this is a bad idea. Without the third armor upgrade, all those knights become useless in the 4th age. How the 4th age plays out depends on earlier decisions. Crossbows would transition into arbalest, cav archers would transition into heavy cav archer, monk siege can transition into sort of whatever, and a knight siege all-in would likely never make it to imperial, because you want to end the game before it gets to that point. There's a large variety of choices here. Take any individual game and it seems pretty simple. What makes it complicated is what the player chose not to do, and why they chose not to do it. There are static factors like the civ matchup and map gen, as well as dynamic factors like how you and your opponent choose to play out the game. This results in a very high skill ceiling on game knowledge and tech tree traversal. You can always have played a particular game better with regards to what decisions you made, simply because there's so many factors to consider. Age of Empires 4 made a number of design choices that stripped away this form of skill expression. Blacksmith upgrades are now unified across unit types. The ranged armor you might research for your 2nd age archers is just as applicable to your 3rd age lancers. This trivializes the transition from one unit type to another. In general, there's just fewer upgrades specific to individual unit lines. Ballistics is free, and there's no thumbring, bloodlines, or husbandry. Furthermore, all civilizations have access to all of the blacksmith upgrades, and the same applies to most unit line upgrades. All of these choices act in tandem to reduce how much players need to commit in order to play a certain composition. In Age of Empires 2, the expense of committing to a specific strategic choice forced players to think carefully about how they were developing their tech tree. Those types of strategic choices just aren't here. I think a reasonable counterargument at this point is that it's important to take Age of Empires 4 at face value, and try to consider other ways it allows for skill expression within the context of its own design. In this case, I'm referring to its asymmetric civ design. In contrast with Age of Empires 2, Age 4 attempts to feature 8 entirely different civilizations with their own mechanics and concepts. This type of depth, theoretically, allows for deep civilization-specific skills that aren't as valued in Age 2. This is definitely a nice idea, and Age of Empires 4 does contain civilizations that are well differentiated, like the Mongols. The problem comes down to incompleteness. It seems to me like the developers wanted the civilizations to be asymmetric, but ran out of time to do it comprehensively. So, with Delhi, you have an interesting hook in the free technologies, scholars, and mosques. But there's not actually much to it. These aren't deep mechanics. Delhi doesn't actually play that much differently from other civilizations. A deeper look at the free research is the best way for me to explain my perspective. In RTS, timings of getting certain upgrades are very important. Getting a key upgrade a few seconds before your opponent can decide a game. Choosing upgrades carefully also matters a lot because upgrades are expensive and time-consuming. Making upgrades free has the potential to be broken because players can now get everything, but slowing down the upgrades also strips away the ability to hit timings, making the player perpetually vulnerable to tempo losses and well-timed attacks. A proper asymmetric game would have given Delhi its own technology tree. This gives the developers freedom to rebalance the upgrades so that the lack of timings and lack of cost don't become broken mechanics. Upgrades would thus play a different role for Delhi than they do for other civs. But that's not how Delhi is implemented. Delhi shares the same technology tree as everyone else. This means the developers had to water down the free research mechanic to the point that it's not very noticeable. The main meaningful gameplay difference is the need to build mosques as the game goes on. Free research basically ends up as an economic bonus that's made up for by a weaker power spike upon aging up. This isn't the only good example. Balance a horse archer and streltsy correctly, and the Rus and French are really not that different. HRE in particular strikes me as an incomplete civilization. It has an identity as an infantry civ, but that's about it. My point here is not that Age of Empires 4 features no differentiation. I understand that China, for example, has several unique mechanics and is not just a vanilla civ. Even Delhi plays very differently on hybrid maps compared to other civilizations. The point I'm trying to make is that the differentiation currently on offer is insufficient and incomplete. Civilization X is an infantry civ, whereas Civilization Y is an archer civ, is not asymmetric design. It's the start of what could be asymmetric design, but it needs to be fleshed out and developed. Differentiation is currently too superficial and lacking in the kind of depth you get from games like Age of Empires 2 or StarCraft 2. This limits skill expression and overall makes the game less interesting. The theme of completeness, I think, is actually the most appropriate way of looking at this game. Consider unit abilities as one example. Charge and Brace were touted pre-release as microable abilities, but in the final release, they're not. The handful of active abilities that did make it into the game mostly got shoved into the 4th Age, not exactly a sign that they're integral to the game's design. It feels to me like, with many things, the developers wanted to have cool abilities, but ran out of time to make them work correctly. The more I play Age of Empires 4, the more it feels like a genuinely incomplete game, a title that was released 6 months or even a year too early. Contrast this again with Age of Empires 2. It's true that Age 2 has been developed and polished for over 20 years. The game that exists today is much better than what was released in 1999. The difference, though, is that Age of Empires 2 was released as a complete game. Everything I described previously, like skill expression through technology development, was part of the game's original design since day one. Most of what came after was iterations on top of that existing formula and didn't necessarily change the core design. This is both good and bad. Problems from the base game, like the design of mesocivs or the limited viability of infantry civs, still impact the meta 2 decades later. Lack of iteration, thus, is just part of the problem with Age of Empires 4. The larger problem is that the design vision is unfinished. Superficial differentiation among civilizations in a game that intends them to be highly asymmetric is not something you can tweak in a config file. It's a major design problem that requires a rework from the ground up. Once you think about Age 4 through the frame of being unfinished, you can't help but see it everywhere. Map generation is another good example. It's common, if not typical, for relics, hunts, berries, and gold mines to spawn in a way that egregiously benefits one player over another. Team games feel similarly incomplete, almost untested. The map sizes are too large, and they end up plagued by wonder victories. I started this section with a description of everything I like about competitive Age of Empires 4. I think there is a lot to like. I've enjoyed playing the game, and I've enjoyed reconnecting with many of my old friends from the AOM and AoE 3 days. But the competitive mode has serious flaws. Once the novelty wears off and the fundamentals of the game start to dawn on you, it becomes less and less interesting. As the game currently stands, I'd rate the competitive play a solid 4 out of 10. It's fun learning a new strategy game, exploring the mechanics, spending time with old friends, seeing all the new content there is to see. Age 4 has been no exception. But, doing my best to be an impartial reviewer, this game is not finished. There's a campaign, but the missions are repetitive and uncreative, the same tired formulas repeated over and over to create the false impression of new content. Competitive play tries to feature asymmetric design, but only achieves it superficially. The scenario editor is non-existent. The map generation is broken. Bugs are everywhere. You often can't click things. Age of Empires 4 is the first mainline Age of Empires game released in more than a decade, and had really big shoes to fill. I'm sad to say, it didn't fill them. Alrighty, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me on Twitter and Facebook, subscribed to me here on YouTube, and checked out my live streams over on Twitch. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.